Look at the Dakotas. They sit perfectly stacked on top of each other, two neat rectangles carved right out of the American Midwest. We usually assume these straight lines were drawn by politicians, carefully dividing up the frontier, but these borders are actually the result of an aggressive corporate land grab. Back in 1861, this entire region was one massive, undivided expanse known as the Dakota Territory. There was no north and there was no south. That changed in the 1870s when railroad tycoons arrived, bringing heavy steam locomotives tearing through the untouched prairie, laying thousands of miles of iron track. These rail companies were operating as aggressive real estate developers. To make back their massive infrastructure investments, they needed to move thousands of settlers into the territory and ship tons of agricultural freight back out. You might expect a massive transportation network to physically tie a sprawling frontier together. Instead, the specific routes these companies chose began to permanently fracture the territory in half. State lines aren't always dictated by geography or democratic vote. In this case, they were hammered into the dirt by corporate infrastructure trying to build a monopoly. The northern half of the Dakota Territory was dominated by rail lines that funneled directly eastward. Every ounce of grain, every head of cattle, and every passenger in this region was economically tethered to the bustling hub of Minneapolis and St. Paul. Meanwhile, the southern rail networks ran on a completely separate grid, pointing straight down into Sioux City and Omaha. This left a massive dead zone of untouched prairie right in the middle of the territory. This chart shows the population density of the Dakota Territory by 1880. Because the southern tracks connected to major immigration hubs, the population exploded to over 98,000 settlers. The isolated northern section barely scraped together 36,000. That extreme population imbalance bred deep resentment. Southern farmers started looking down on the north as a rough frontier, populated mostly by transient cattle ranchers and fur trappers. Because these two sprawling rail networks ran parallel and never intersected, their populations never interacted. A single contiguous territory had been split into two entirely alienated worlds. The tension snapped in 1883. Territorial Governor Nehemiah G. Ordway packed up the government and abandoned the highly populated southern capital of Yankton, moving all political operations north to Bismarck. The southern residents were furious at losing their political leverage. In retaliation, they held a rogue convention that September and drafted their own separate state constitution without federal approval. This bitter regional hostility paralyzed the United States Congress. Lawmakers stalled for 6 years, unable to figure out how to handle the fractured territory, until they finally passed the Enabling Act of 1889 to legally split it in two. Even the final paperwork was an exercise in extreme political caution. President Benjamin Harrison had his Secretary of State shuffle the documents before signing them, completely blind. He refused to let either North or South Dakota claim the prestige of being admitted to the Union first. By the time the ink dried, the government was simply putting a political rubber stamp on a geographic division the rail companies had engineered years earlier. Railroad corporations micromanaged the geography of the plains, planting communities exactly where the tracks required them. They willed entire towns into existence, plotting out main streets on empty prairie. Corporate engineers designed these towns as shipping nodes, positioning them to consolidate grain and cattle so that every outbound car ran at full capacity. Take LeBeau, South Dakota. The railroad placed it right on the eastern edge of the Cheyenne River Indian Reservation to serve as a high-volume cattle hub. By 1908, LeBeau was an instant boomtown, shipping out $1 million worth of livestock in a single year. But manufactured boomtowns have a fatal structural flaw. Because they were imported overnight to serve one specific industry, they lacked the diverse local economies needed to survive a crisis. When a community's entire existence is tied to a single corporate balance sheet, it becomes entirely disposable. For LeBeau, the crisis hit in the early 1920s. A local rancher was murdered, a massive fire wiped out the hastily built business district, and a severe drought began suffocating the region. Without cattle and crops to fill the cars, the railroad's math no longer made sense. The rail company simply cut its losses and abandoned LeBeau, turning the booming hub into a ghost town almost overnight. That collapse foreshadowed a much larger disaster in the 1930s. The environmental devastation of the Dust Bowl wiped out millions of acres of fertile topsoil, destroying the agricultural foundation that kept the remaining railroad towns alive. The final blow came a few decades later. As the interstate highway system expanded and automobiles took over, the tracks became obsolete. By 1969, passenger rail service in South Dakota was completely dead. Today, the physical remnants of this era still dot the Great Plains. You can drive for miles and see abandoned infrastructure, like towering wooden grain elevators standing alone next to empty fields. The iron tracks laid by 19th century tycoons permanently fractured the territory, etched the modern state borders into the map, and left behind a landscape of disposable communities.